Hi, everyone. I'm Marilyn. I'm part of the marketing team at Ally.io, and I'm joined by Rick Klau, who spent over 13 years at Google, most recently as a senior operating partner for Google Ventures, and has a wealth of knowledge around objectives and key results. Rick, can you tell us a little bit more about your background?
Sure. I was a startup guy for the first dozen or so years of my career. After graduating law school, worked at a number of startups, primarily in the legal tech space, and then moved into more horizontal internet software companies. The last startup I was at was a company called FeedBurner that was acquired by Google in 2007. And for the last 13 plus years, I was on the Google campus, first in business development, then as a product manager, ran Blogger, was part of the team that built Google Plus. And then the last PM role I had was running the homepage at YouTube, and really thought that would be the job they'd bury me in. I loved working both at that scale and on that particular product. But the guy that had hired me to run Blogger, that had brought me into the product org, was a guy named Joe Kraus. And Joe had moved over to Google Ventures at the time and made a case that they really needed somebody with the breadth of startup experience, but also someone who had a fairly wide and deep network inside of Google. And I made the move in 2011 and was there until just recently.
Awesome. And so when you search Google OKRs on Google, if you go to videos, you are in the first video that pops up, and I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with that. It's a video on how Google sets OKRs, and it has almost 1 million views. So my question to you is, how did you become sort of that spokesperson for OKRs in Google? How did you become that person who was doing that video?
Yeah, the irony, of course, with OKRs is that you're supposed to pick your spots and succeed at them. And this was entirely an accident. At the time, the first role I had at GV was running something called the Startup Lab. The goal there was, how can we deploy Google's expertise alongside the capital that GV was putting to work inside of early stage startups? And a number of questions that were coming back to me, both through the investors at GV as well as directly from some of the founders, was very simple. How does Google manage to set goals, get alignment across teams? There wasn't really much written publicly at the time about OKRs. And part of what we were doing at the Startup Lab was a series of workshops where we'd try and bring an expert in, offer up whatever they happen to know, make them available for Q&A. And OKRs felt like a fairly dry, somewhat boring topic. So rather than bother any of the experts at Google, it felt like something that I could do so that we could at least answer the question and move on. I got a hold of John Doerr's original deck that he had presented to Google's leadership back in, I think it was 99, put together some slides on my own experience, and then made it available for the audience that was in the room. And then there was a live stream, so some questions came in. And honestly assumed that at the time it was only being shared within the GV portfolio. We'd go on and wouldn't think much about it. 7 or 8 months later, the marketing team was putting together a YouTube channel, needed a handful of public videos that could be on the channel at launch. And this was one of the rare workshop videos that we had given, meaning someone inside of GV, not either someone at Google or an outside presenter. And as a result, I had complete confidence that the material was not sensitive. I wasn't revealing state secrets. And for a couple of reasons, we didn't have the camera on anyone in the audience, so we didn't have to get releases signed. So it actually was only because it satisfied those criteria, not because we thought it was going to be compelling viewing. Me talking about goals for 90 minutes seemed like the last thing that would occupy lots of attention on YouTube. And we put it on the channel, didn't think much of it. And then a few weeks later, I think TechCrunch got a hold of it. And that was the first of many discoveries. And then it took on a life of its own.
That's pretty awesome. And you mentioned this. Could you speak a little more about when you first started using OKRs at Google and what that process was like for you? A lot of people have a hard time when they first start using OKRs. They have a hard time writing them or really understanding the framework. What was your experience starting to use them?
First time using them was right after FeedBurner got acquired. So I joined a business development team and was told, okay, it's about to be a new quarter. So one of the first things we need you to do is draft your OKRs. I had no idea what the acronym meant. I'd never seen anyone talk about the process. And honestly, having worked at startups previously, there was not exactly a discipline or a framework that we were using to establish goals. It was do the things that need doing and periodically check in, see if there are better things to do. So my first introduction was very much a dive into the deep end of the pool, figure it out as I went, largely by observing really the immediate team around me, trying to distill what seems to define the people who are doing it well. What are the common characteristics? And it was, they were committing to a few things. They were ambitious. There were metrics associated with the few goals they were committing to. And it seemed at the outset, they were setting themselves up for a failure because several of the things seemed pretty likely to not happen. Like it just seemed like it was outside the realm of probability, if not possibility. And those, of course, as I came to better understand OKRs in the years that followed, were exactly the things that made them critical to Google's success over time.
Awesome. And yeah, we talk a lot about the need for leadership buy-in and commitment to the framework for it to be successful, and kind of the cultural shift that's really focused on these OKRs and on these goals. Have you, in your experience, have you found that that's true, and have you seen organizations fail because they didn't have that buy-in? Or in your experience, like how important is it to have that commitment from the leadership level to make it work?
Oh, I think it's table stakes. If you don't have leadership not only understanding what these are about, but agreeing that they're important and conveying that to the entire organization, I think if you're not set up to fail, I think you're at least adding a considerable amount of headwind to the organization succeeding. I think a lot of it, for me, feels a lot like learning a new language. Yeah. If the company is committing to OKRs as a framework, but only in the product org, well, then product has learned how to talk about the stuff that they do or don't do. And no one else in the company understands when they're saying no. They're not saying no because they don't like you. They're saying no because they've agreed to focus on a handful of higher value, more impactful things. If the entire company is speaking that language, that is a much easier conversation to have. And it's easier to interpret what you're hearing when another group is answering your question, which is, I need you to focus on X, and product says, actually, we're allocating our resources on these other things, so that's not going to get our attention this quarter. I think it's just, it is so much easier if the CEO has communicated to her team how important this is and how universally it needs to be understood and adopted across the company. I just think she's setting up the company for much higher likelihood of success.
I love that you mentioned the language. That's so true. Everyone has to be on the same page for it to work. I love that way to define it. Is there any other advice you would give an organization who is just starting off with OKRs about implementing them successfully?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, don't assume you're going to get it right the first time. Be okay um, looking back 3 months later if you've determined that a quarterly cadence is the appropriate amount of time. That first quarter might feel a little uncomfortable. But one of the best things that CEO can do is demonstrate to her team, look, no one's getting a scarlet letter because they got a 0 on an OKR. No one's getting punished. There's no stigma that will follow that team. We've learned something. We now know a little bit more than we knew before. That'll help the next set of predictions we make about the outcomes we can accomplish. Or potentially we've learned about where there are headwinds to the team, to the company that we didn't know about. And now we know about them. So we're smarter. The other thing I think I wish I could go back and edit of the video. I mean, I'd make it a lot shorter now that I know that so many people watched it. But the thing that I would change, and I didn't know at the time, but that I've learned now having had conversations with hundreds of startups, founders, leadership teams, is that particularly for the scenario you outlined, which is the CEO or the team starting out with OKRs and trying to give it a go, don't worry about individual OKRs. It almost doesn't matter what the size of the company is. Focus on setting a handful of objectives at the company level. The fewer, the better. Companies always tell me they need 4 or 5 or 6. I always try and tell them they've only got 3. 2 would even be better than 3. But then translate that from the company level to the team level. Don't go any further. Until, to go back to my example of learning a language, until you've developed a fluency in how to communicate with each other about what it is you're doing, what you've agreed to not do. Ultimately, I think that's arguably even more important than the things you have committed to. Trying to translate that into individual commitments, I think is going to be both hard and not that much more productive if you happen to get it right early on. I think the better thing to do is get the organization as a whole executing a little bit more nimbly, communicating with each other well, starting to see some predictions of the future come true, right? Nothing feels better as a team than predicting an unreasonable outcome and then doing everything in your power to make it happen. And then looking back and saying, wow, we did that. That was because we made it happen. It wasn't inevitable. Only after that point, and that might be 2, 4, 8 quarters, then I think you'll start to see some individuals in the organization start to say, okay, this is maybe a useful way for me to think about stretching outside of what I'm already committed to within my team. Maybe I'll learn a new language, right? At Google, in a lot of cases, the way people used individual OKRs was as a way of stretching beyond the commitments they'd made to up-level their capacity to take on future commitments. So it was almost like investing ahead of when you need the skill to know that you'd be capable of stepping up when needed. But I think if a company tried to do all of that at once, I think it will feel harder, and there will be a lot more reasons for people to look at this and say, this isn't helping me. It's making it feel like it's harder to accomplish anything.
Right. I love that you said that. Yeah, and I think one of the battles is when individuals, especially, look at OKRs as another task they need to complete, another thing on their checklist that's just taking up their time. And yeah, the question is, how do you make it so that it's not just this other task that's taking up your time to complete, and how do we make it valuable? So you brought up some really, really good points there. And it also sounds like when you touched on when you do use individual OKRs, this personal professional growth, do you think, can you talk a little bit more about, do you think it can help, like when an individual does use OKRs, it can help them kind of be more motivated or invested in their work if they have these more personal growth goals?
For me, I think the biggest way it can help is it starts to feel second nature, that you are, at least in a professional sense, you get used to setting somewhat unreasonable goals that feel like they might be a little hard, if not impossible, to accomplish. And instead of at the end focusing on the absolute evaluation of, did you get all of what you said you were going to get? Or did you focus on the relative growth and expansion of skill or ability? Because in my view, if you do the latter, right, don't focus so much on whether you got a 1.0 score, but did you get better? Have you added a tool to your tool chest that might come in handy down the road? The more second nature this approach to stretching and striving to get better, the more second nature that becomes, I think the more comfortable, the more fluent you will feel in an organization where that becomes one of the defining characteristics for how the company works. And it will start to feel a little more effortless, and it will just start to be like the air you breathe. It's just there. In fact, I would argue, back to my example of being the accidental OKR guy, part of why I didn't want to reach out and ask Urs or Sergey or anybody else at Google about OKRs, it didn't feel like a thing we knew how to do. It was just a thing we did, right? If that distinction makes sense, it wasn't something we spent a lot of time interrogating ourselves about. How do we use OKRs? How do we think about OKRs? We just did. And it was only after having had so many of these conversations with CEOs and leadership teams that you realize, well, wow, for a lot of companies, part of why they struggle is they don't have that scaffolding in place for how they think about who they are, how they set their goals, how they say no to things comfortably, confidently. So every one of those decisions that they have to make takes time. It's hard. And that slows you down.
That's super interesting way to put it. Yeah, and it sounds like in your experience at Google, OKRs were so embedded into the way you work that, yeah, you never, at least my impression is, you never had to think about the process because that it was just embedded into the culture. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. There was a moment for me when I was part of the team building what became Google Plus. Sergey was in basically every major strategy meeting for a number of months. And then at some point, his focus shifted. Google X was starting to stand up on its own at that point. And so he wasn't at as many of those meetings. But what became clear to me was that because OKRs were so ingrained in how the organization operated, that we all knew fairly completely how Larry and Sergey thought about decision making. And it didn't mean that they were unnecessary. They were, of course, absolutely critical throughout Google's evolution. But what it meant was when any of us had decisions to be made, four of us might be around a table and there would be a spirited discussion. And then most of the time, it was as if we could channel them into the room and say, well, if they were here, this is what they would say. And more often than not, you'd get to some consensus because you already had that framework that had been communicated the prior quarter and the quarter before that about what was actually most important and how to measure whether we had the outcome that we wanted. So that didn't eliminate every escalation that needed to go to them, but probably about 90% of the time, our team and literally every other team that was having similar discussions and decisions to be made could make them on the spot, as if Larry and Sergey had been in the room, but without needing them to be in the room. So the speed that gathers as we got better at channeling them and agreeing on, yeah, well, that on this particular decision that we have to make, we think the outcome would be greater if we did A versus B. It means that 90% of those potential decisions aren't sitting in their inboxes waiting for their feedback.
Right. That's awesome. That's a very cool way to look at it and see how successful it can be used successfully. That's awesome. In your opinion, what's the most valuable part about OKRs and a company using them? Like what's the biggest value that a company could get from OKRs?
I would love to tell you that I knew this from day one. I think it took years of conversations that happened relatively organically after the video started taking off. And it's counterintuitive. The most valuable part from my point of view about OKRs is not about what is in the OKRs, it's what's not in the OKRs. Yes, you've committed to a few goals. Yes, you've defined the metrics that if you've successfully achieved those goals, this is what that success will look like. But it's what you're giving yourselves permission to say no to, and to say no without it feeling political, mm-hmm. or feel like somebody's playing favorites. Oh, well, you said no to her idea, but you said yes to my idea. Like that, for me, is the key. Because oddly enough, when you give your teams permission to say no to good ideas, they're not going to stop thinking about the good ideas, but they're going to start to understand that there's a time and a place to contemplate them. Let's not distract ourselves. Just because someone had a good idea on a Tuesday stand-up meeting, let's finish the stuff we said we were going to do. We might not succeed at all of it. In fact, we probably won't, but we'll have learned more, and we can encode that. That becomes part of the institutional memory at the organization, on top of which I will know the next time I have a good idea and someone quickly says no, it's not because the idea wasn't good or I'm not good. There is no faster way to kill momentum or initiative at a company than to disincent creativity amongst the team. And if you've not got something like OKRs in place that makes it easy and comfortable and apolitical for those no's to come, then people start to get frustrated because they don't understand how decisions get made. They don't understand why their stuff never seems to rise above the fold. And teams will suffer. Mm-hmm. So I always, for me, the lens I look for when talking to a company for the first time, what have you said no to? And not only what have you said no to in the past, but how do you say no in the moment? Do you have a process by which you can get to that quickly? So you avoid chasing every squirrel that goes by your window. That for me, there's a lot of other components that are, I think, pieces of what make the OKR framework so powerful. But if I had to pick one, it's the no. It's what have you said no to? How do you say no?
I love that. This is very well said. And I feel like, even personally being in marketing services a lot of other departments, and everyone wants something, right? So having that power to say no and prioritize is, I experience it all the time, and it's very important. And for me personally, I'm a people pleaser. I want to say yes to everyone. So it's nice to be able to say no and just focus on what's the most important. So I love that you said that.
Well, and it's ingrained. If we're high potential contributors, we love saying yes. We
Right.
love rewarding the good idea. We want to consider all good ideas, but in the absence of a committed direction, all good ideas are equally valid. And so there's no reason to pick one over another. So you're either paralyzed looking at all the potential good ideas, or you've picked one and then every other good idea and its owner feels neglected, which
Right.
is not a recipe for long-term success.
Right. Yeah, it's very true. Awesome. So outside of work, I wanted to ask you, do you have personal OKRs? Like in your personal life, do you make a list of some objectives and key results?
Not as such.
Okay.
I will tell you that I am a much more metric-oriented individual than I ever was before I got to Google. Marissa Mayer was famous for repeating what I think was a Jim Barksdale line from his Netscape days, which was, if we have data, let's go with data. If we're going to go with opinions, let's go with mine, right? And so that becomes a fairly ingrained approach, certainly in the work experience. But as I'm currently evaluating, exploring what I do next in my post Google career, even applying that lens to how I'm spending my time, evaluating how my calendar is getting filled, the number of discussions that I'm having, the people I'm having them with, it would be easy, I think, to fall into a comfortable cadence of chatting with friends, reaching out to folks I haven't talked to in a while, instead of being more outcome oriented, which is, of course, at the end of this process, I intend to have someone who wants me to be doing something full time for which they're paying me something. And the analysis I'm bringing to that process is very much one that's entirely data driven. And there is a process I've put around it so that I'm reviewing progress each week, going back and looking at the last several months and sort of refactoring if I learned what I thought I was setting myself up to learn. But no, on the specific front, I think my wife and kids would have my head if I approached life in the house like I did at work, even
That
though my
makes
office is now in my house. So it is
right.
definitely a blurrier line than it used to be.
There is for sure, but that is very valid. And you just touched on this, and this is my last question for you is, you recently left Google Ventures. What's next?
It's funny. I don't know. When I finally shared my news publicly a few weeks ago, a number of people reached out sort of privately saying, okay, so what's the other side of that discussion? Like, you must have something teed up. I actually, for the first time in my career, I took my own advice. For the last probably 8, 10 years, anytime anybody has asked me for career advice, I've told them, don't decide to take the next job or not take the next job. Take the time so that you've evaluated a number of possible paths. So when you've committed to one, it wasn't just a binary yes or no to that one, but it was compared to all of the other possible options, it was the best for you, for what you were seeking to do. And this particular period, and now probably 3 months in, has been some of the most fulfilling set of conversations. I've talked to nonprofits, I've talked to some venture-backed startups, I've talked to a couple of founders thinking about their next thing and wanting to bounce ideas off. Every week has been more invigorating than the last, and I have no idea when I've made that commitment, what it'll look like. Probably going to be a few more months of still treating this like a full-time job, but one of the most fun periods of time I've had in my career, which has been just delightful. Only risk is that I'm going to have too much fun doing this and not want to commit. But I'm so focused on impact, right, and outcomes, and wanting to be part of a team that's capable of producing outsized results. I think the only thing I miss in this period is that I am just me. There is no team, and I've been privileged over the last 20 years to be part of some pretty extraordinary teams. So that'll be what pulls me to the next thing. Just trying to be very patient.
Got it. Well, it sounds like whatever you decide, it'll be exciting, and it's exciting to hear. I'll be looking forward to hearing where you land. Yeah, those are all the questions I have for you. Is there anything else you'd like to add about anything, OKRs or unrelated to that?
Well, it's interesting. This will feel like you all set me up for the plug. I've had conversations over the last maybe month, we'll call it, with a number of startups who've reached out wanting, now that they know I'm no longer inside of GV, they want to know if I can use some of my free time to chat with them. And I just had this conversation late last week with a CEO at a startup who was asking about, as they deploy OKRs, what tools should they use? And I've long been of the mind that you never start with the tool before you get the framework or the process determined. But what I've now seen just in 3 straight conversations over a couple of weeks is a number of cases where trying to go the DIY route, either in Google Slides or Sheets, I had somebody trying to do it in Asana. It creates friction where you're already fighting against what feels intuitive, right? Let's just do the good things. Let's check back in at the end of a month, at the end of a quarter. So learning how to say no to lots of good ideas, learning how to get alignment across teams, all of that stuff is hard. Lacking a common platform while you try to do that makes it harder. So while I would never tell you, pick a tool and you'll get it right and it'll be easy, what I've increasingly figured out is that for these teams that are getting started, committing to something, ideally something that is purpose-built for this initiative, at a minimum increases the likelihood of success. So when you're looking for, like, how do we set the team up for success? How do we eliminate the obvious obstacles or hurdles that would potentially get in our way? It's one of the reasons I've been thrilled to chat with you and Vetri over the last month or two. It's seeing that there are tools that just did not exist 8 years ago when I recorded that video, that I think make it that much more likely that there's just a tremendous amount of potential to get unlocked, which is exciting. So I'm like you telling me you're excited about where I'm heading. It's been fun to get to know you all and see where this is heading, because I think what you are able to enable and accelerate for companies bodes really well for those companies that are willing to make that investment. So we'll I'll leave it there.
Thank you.